And here's where it all comes together. What is the meaning behind ascetic ideals? Ascetic ideals being concepts like chastity, poverty, and humility. The morality of less, of conservation. Also a voluntary form of suffering imposed upon the self. Before the knife goes in directly with an answer, he asks some other questions and points at certain types of people, like artists. What does the ascetic ideal mean for an artist? Nietzsche thinks that no artist should take himself too seriously. Indeed, that the suffering which produced a masterpiece is meant to be forgotten if one is to enjoy it. Again, we have the pregnancy symbolism, how the bearing and painful birth of a child should be forgotten if one is to enjoy the child itself. Nietzsche goes on to say that artists are not what they create, because if they were, there would be no need to create what they already are. So in terms of an artist, the ascetic ideal means nothing. This is a point I'll pick up later because it actually answers the question I left open at the end of the last video. Next, he asks the same question, but what does the ascetic ideal mean to a philosopher? And it's really interesting because Nietzsche is as critical of philosophers as he is of religion and science. When a philosopher pays homage to the ascetic ideal, to these Socratic values of self-mastery over the appetitive, they're seeking a release from the torture of the human condition. Sensuality has been generally irritating and hated by philosophers. Sex seems to impede the intellectual pursuit of truth, and Nietzsche gives some examples of philosophers and how they never got married. As for people with an interest in truth, marriage could be construed as a hindrance from that pursuit. Nietzsche says that ascetic ideals can lead to independence and higher spirituality, which some philosophers believe is closer to the truth. But as I have demonstrated with Nietzsche, he's not big on the spiritual stuff. So to him, philosophers seem to have a bias. But Nietzsche said it was the ascetic ideal which allowed philosophers to survive and thrive, holding back on human impulses to develop deeper thoughts and feelings, a self-mastery of life itself. He brings up this gritty vision of a man who wounds himself and how the wound compels him to live. So that's it for the meaning of the ascetic ideal in the philosopher. It means a lot to him. Lastly, he takes a look at the priestly class. What does the ascetic ideal mean to them? The shepherds of what Nietzsche considers the sick people, a threat to humanity. Nietzsche says that the priests are sickly people trying to heal sickly people. The priest heals the suffering of the sick, but not the cause of it, because the priest's solution is God. Thus, the priest exploits human guilt by saying God is the only one that can heal you, to a point where a religious person will cry out for more suffering, more tribulation, believing his heavenly reward will be even greater. To the priest, the ascetic ideal is his ultimate power, a path to heaven and an example to follow, to be heard and worshipped as a proxy of God. And so Nietzsche returns to his original question. What is the meaning behind the ascetic ideal? Why is it so powerful and pervasive throughout humanity? We already know that it encompasses philosophy, but Nietzsche thinks that it also encompasses science as well. That science isn't the opposing ideal to the ascetic ideal, but that art is. Art. So we're returning to this concept of how an artist must learn to forget his suffering if he is to enjoy the work he has produced. Nietzsche finally peels back his answer by saying that the ascetic ideal was simply the first meaning humanity came up with for itself. Early man was suffering from a lack of meaning and suffering in general. By adopting ascetic ideals, we gained religion and philosophy, ostensibly creating things theoretically greater than ourselves. Before the ascetic ideal, there was no goal for humanity other than survival. And Nietzsche doesn't like this. He thinks man should become the greatest thing if it isn't already. Once again, man has no particular problem with suffering. But why does that suffering take place? That's what bothers us. Man will seek out and desire suffering, if there's a good reason for it. And that's what the ascetic ideal was. That's what it offered to man. So now we have this question of what do we do with suffering? The origin of good and evil, bad conscience, and the ascetic ideal. These are all things Nietzsche has been talking about, but not things to stand by. Just things that have afflicted man for too long, that we have to overcome. And yeah, Nietzsche suggests art. That art is the conversion of suffering into beauty. Something useful, a pregnancy brought to term, a way for man to redeem himself without divinity, to stand on his own and overcome his guilt, his bloody past, and to ensure a bright future. If you guys have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. Let me know what you thought. I'm sure I'm not dead on, but I tried, If you guys want to see more of me, please subscribe. This is Ryan Starbloke, and you better have a good day.